Okay, well, I now have the very great pleasure of facilitating a session with Megan Mitchell from the Australian Human Rights Commission, who will present her very wide-ranging findings from her Child Rights Report and highlight new data on the prevalence and impact of family violence on children and young people. Now, most of you will need no introduction to Megan. She's got a very high profile. She is Australia's first National Children's Commissioner, and she commenced her term in March 2013. Megan's focus is solely on the rights and interests of children and the laws, policies and programs that impact on them. Megan has extensive experience in issues facing children and young people, having worked with children from all types of backgrounds, including undertaking significant work with vulnerable children. She has practical expertise in child protection, foster and kinship care, juvenile justice, children's services, childcare, disabilities and early intervention and prevention services. Please make Megan very welcome.
Thank you, Kay, for the introduction, and to Professor Edwards and to ANROWS for inviting me here today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathering, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to also pay respects to elders past and present, as well as to other Aboriginal people in the room here today. I'd also like to thank ANROWS for the fabulous work it does and for putting on this inaugural event, and let's hope there's many more, because you can't have an inaugural one and not do it again. And also I'd like to acknowledge the leadership of Heather Nankaro as well, and all the great work that she does. By way of introduction, I'd like to say a little bit about my role as National Children's Commissioner and why eliminating violence from children's lives is such an important issue. So, as Kay pointed out, my role is to monitor and advocate for the rights of all children in Australia. And each year I make a report, and I'm required to make a report to Federal Parliament on the state of child rights in Australia. And the work I do is informed by the rights and principles outlined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. This is an international treaty that was ratified by Australia in 1990 and is the most ratified of all international human rights treaties. And this convention has 4 guiding principles: non-discrimination, best interests, participation and protection and survival. The Convention also explicitly refers to family and domestic violence. Under Article 19, it gives every child the absolute right to live free from all forms of violence and requires protection for children who are exposed to and witness family and domestic violence. There is a committee called the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child that reviews countries' progress every 5 years. And in 2012, Australia's progress was reviewed by that committee. And at the time, the committee expressed grave concern at our children's experiences of family and domestic violence in this country, and in particular in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And it's not just adults in Geneva who are worried about violence in children's lives. In 2013, during my national listening tour in my first year, children and young people repeatedly raised with me their concerns about feeling safe and the importance of living free from all kinds of violence. In 2014, I examined the issue of intentional self-harm and suicide in children, and this highlighted an intersection between self-harm and family and domestic violence, and I identified this as an area that required further research. As you can see from this slide, of the thousands of calls received by the Kids Helpline where the child's primary concern was suicide or self-harm, family conflict and relationships was a co-concern in 17.8% of calls about suicide and 17.3% of calls about self-harm. So this prompted me to think about the relationship between self-harm and exposure to family violence and conflict. This idea was reinforced through the submissions and roundtables that I did as part of the project, and in fact in one jurisdiction a police officer relayed to me that having reviewed all child suicide cases in the previous year, every case came from a background characterised by family violence. Because of this, my 2015 project focused on the experience of children affected by family violence. But of course, I was also cognisant of the remarkable conversation about the prevalence and impact of family violence that we're currently having in this country. Through this and other work by agencies like ANROWS and others, we're beginning to understand the devastating effect family violence has on children, as witnesses, as bystanders, but also as direct victims. Sorry, I'll go back there. One tragic story in particular pricked Australia's consciousness. As we all know, on February 12, 2014, just over 2 years ago now, Greg Anderson killed his 11-year-old son, Luke. Luke's mother, Rosie, rose above her personal tragedy to speak out about the scourge of family and domestic violence. She captured the nation's attention with her bravery and continues to do so. And because of her courage and the courage of other adults and children who have spoken out, we can no longer ignore this issue. Federal, state and territory governments, our nation's leaders in business and the community, have come together in unprecedented ways at this precise point in history to address family and domestic violence. For example, at the national level, over $3 million has been provided to CrimTrack to develop and test a prototype for a national domestic violence order scheme to strengthen the identification and enforcement of DVOs across state and territory borders. Further, COAG has agreed to undertake a national campaign for reducing family and domestic violence, with a key objective to change young people's attitudes. It's also encouraging that governments have committed to incorporating respectful relationships programs into classrooms across the nation. There are two significant intersecting national policy measures in place which include plans to address children's experiences of violence. We've heard a lot about the national plan to reduce violence against women and their children, but there's also another plan which is called the National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children. And they're both now looking at domestic violence issues. As Children's Commissioner, this national conversation and this renewed policy commitment has provided me with the opportunity to raise the importance of a child's right to live free from violence and put a spotlight on the unique experiences of children. This became the focus of my 2015 annual statutory report to Parliament. Through this examination, I sought to identify and highlight the unique experiences of children affected by family violence and to ascertain which areas demand further attention and examination. To do this, we conducted a literature review, received and analysed written submissions, held a series of expert roundtables and a webinar, and analysed available data and sourced new data. And many people in this room made a significant contribution to this work, and I thank you for that. I also sought to hear the voice of children themselves, working with the Kids Helpline again to understand more about the context they receive about family violence and accessing other relevant survey and research material. And these have been invaluable. So what do we know about family and domestic violence and kids? Children's experiences are often described as either witnessing violence, being exposed to violence, or being directly abused in the context of family and domestic violence. The data that I reviewed through the examination identified that while children's experiences are widespread and serious, the quality, consistency and availability of data about children's exposure is at present pretty much a national disgrace and mostly derived through one-off surveys, estimates, proxy measures or administrative data sets like those associated with child protection or homelessness services. For example, information from specialist homelessness services provides part of the picture as to the size and nature of this issue. Of the 254,000 clients in 2013-14, more than a quarter were children, and a similar amount reported family and domestic violence as the main reason for seeking assistance. Information from child protection datasets also helps us to build a picture of exposure to violence. So in 2013 and 14, just under 41,000 children were the subject of substantiated child protection notifications in Australia. 40% concerned emotional abuse, and in most jurisdictions that frequently is a proxy for exposure to domestic violence. 28% concerned neglect, 19% concerned physical abuse, and 14% concerned sexual abuse. Research also tells us that family violence and child abuse are interrelated, with one study estimating that domestic violence is present in 55% of physical abuse cases and 40% of sexual abuse cases against children. Despite this, family and domestic violence is not routinely or consistently recorded in child protection systems, even though it is one of the strongest drivers of children into the out-of-home care system in this country. While there is limited direct information about the prevalence of children being witnesses or bystanders, the 2012 Personal Safety Survey, which you've heard a lot about here, reveals that much of the partner violence reported by women and men is seen or heard by children in their care. Further, so there's only one 2001 survey of Australians aged 12 to 20 found that just under 24% of respondents reported having witnessed an act of physical violence by their father or stepfather against their mother or stepmother. It's important to note that exposure to violence, even in the absence of direct abuse, as we've heard here, can have clear detrimental impacts on children and is increasingly being recognised as a form of child abuse in itself. And it's for this reason that amendments were made to the Family Law Act in 2012, which broadened the definition of family violence to include circumstances in which children are exposed to family violence. But as we've seen in the previous presentation, the extent to which those changes have resulted in reform practice, however, is a live question and one that is raised frequently with me by both children and adults. So there is a little more information out there in relation to children as direct victims of physical and sexual abuse by a family member, but this is still compromised in fundamental ways. I sourced data from the ABS recorded crimes victim data, which shows that in the 4 states only, which was the only data that was available, there were more than 14,000 police recorded child victims of assault by a family member and 12,000 recorded victims of assault of sexual assault. But as you can see, they're only in some states only. If we are shocked by the fact that one woman dies every week at the hands of a partner or ex-partner, the situation for children isn't far behind, with one child every 2 weeks or every fortnight killed by a family member. The Australian Institute of Criminology released a report in 2015 which considered the characteristics of family and domestic homicides for the 10-year period to 2012. The data showed that children comprise the second most frequent group of victims of family and domestic violence, 21% after intimate partner homicides. And 51% of all filicide cases homicides where the victim is the child of the offender involve children between 1 to 9 years old. Detailed information about deaths of children in a family and domestic context in New South Wales is also available in the annual reports of the New South Wales Domestic Violence Review Team. And in 2013, the team found that children represented 21% of all homicides that occurred in the context of family and domestic violence in that reporting period. Data derived from the Personal Safety Survey for this work that I did last year indicates that the number of adults who experienced violence within the family context as a child are staggering. As you can see, the numbers are, close to 1 million women and 600,000 adult men first experienced physical abuse by a family member between before they were 15 years of age. And again, very high numbers relating to sexual abuse as well. Fathers represent the largest proportion of perpetrators for those children. And almost 60% experienced the first violent incident between the ages, or reported that they experienced the first violent incident between the ages of 4 and 9. As in many other areas, family and domestic violence disproportionately affects Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. Nationally, in 2013, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women were 34.2 times more likely, and men 28.3 times more likely to be hospitalised for non-fatal family violence-related assaults than non-Indigenous females and males. The custom data that I obtained from the ABS shows that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are also overrepresented as victims of physical and sexual assault, as this graph shows. Again, the picture is incomplete and data is available for some states only. My examination also sought to ascertain the extent to which we understand the impact family violence has on children. And I confirmed that in that work that family and domestic violence can have wide-ranging impacts on children. Among other things, it can manifest itself in mood problems, aggression and antisocial behaviour, low self-esteem, loneliness and impaired cognitive function. This supports existing research that indicates that the effects of violence may manifest itself differently depending on the developmental stages of children. For example, infants and toddlers affected by family violence may exhibit delayed language, delayed toilet training and disrupted attachment, among other things. Older children may exhibit aggressive behaviour, anxiety and poor verbal abilities. In adolescence, mental health issues, anger, depression and suicidal ideation may be more likely. In relation to what kids say themselves about the impact of family and domestic violence, the Kids Helpline provided me with information on contacts about family violence, as well as the thoughts and feelings of children in the form of case notes. So, as you can see, around 1,000 contacts were made which were directly related to family violence, and most of them were in a younger age group, which was interesting for them and for me. And the largest proportion was in relation to exposure to violence between parents or between a parent and ex-partner. Some of the common themes that were in the case notes related to these contexts was fear for their own safety, the safety of siblings or the safety of the victim of abuse, anxiety, isolation and loneliness, anger, both towards the perpetrator and the victim, sympathy for the victim and sometimes the perpetrator, confused feelings towards the perpetrator, that is both anger and love for a violent father, for instance, guilt over having bad thoughts about the perpetrator, e.g. wishing they would die, feelings of responsibility to protect the family or stop the violence. I think that's a really interesting window into the kids' perceptions. It's important to note that in relation to help seeking, these are very low numbers, representing less than 1% of all calls to the helpline. The issue of how to bolster help seeking by adults has been raised a number of times at this conference, and it appears that this is just as much an issue for children. The issue of intergenerational violence was also raised when I was undertaking this work, and several submissions discussed the importance of effective intervention to break the intergenerational cycle of violence. This is not a new issue. For instance, the New South Wales Domestic Violence Death Review Team's 2013 annual report found that over half of the parents that killed their children in the reporting period reported having been victims of violence and abuse during their childhood. And similarly, the AIFS in 2015 noted that longitudinal and population-based studies have consistently linked exposure to domestic and family violence with future perpetration. So what are the key issues that arose from the work that I undertook last year? In addition to providing further information on the prevalence and impact of family violence experienced by children, I was able to identify a lot of gaps in our understanding and areas that warrant further attention. In particular, there's significant work to do to develop reliable national data about the prevalence of family and domestic violence perpetrated by children, against children. Such data gaps undermine our ability to understand the full impact on our most vulnerable children. It's very difficult to build a national picture about children impacted by family and domestic violence if we don't measure it, or we don't measure it well. We don't care about it, and if we don't care about it, we won't do anything about it. Without good information, we cannot understand the extent and the nature of the impact of family and domestic violence on children, nor identify the most effective ways to address it. One of the key barriers is about reliable national definitions in use. Across Australia, there are no consistent definitions, legal frameworks or common methods used to identify family and domestic violence. It is encouraging that efforts are underway to remedy this, and we know that the ABS has been tasked as part of the work of the National Plan to develop a national data collection and reporting framework. This will hopefully lead to a common language and definitional framework which can be used across Australian jurisdictions to record and measure family, domestic and sexual violence. However, in order to understand this issue as it relates to children, it's imperative that children's experiences are recorded as a separate entry and not just part of an adult entry. And that's why I recommended that data about children's experience as a victim of family and domestic violence be included as a separate entry in the ABS National Data Collecting and Reporting Framework. I just think I'll move on a bit. Further research is also needed in other areas. For example, there is limited breakdown on the age of the child victims. The custom data I was able to get could not be disaggregated beyond 0 to 9, 10 to 14 and 15 to 17. And these groupings are too broad to be particularly helpful. There's a world of difference between the developmental stage and issues for a child under 2 and children of, say, a 7-year-old. Sibling violence is also an issue that requires greater investigation. Research from the Kids Helpline found that almost 14% of contacts raised the issue of family and domestic violence involving violence by siblings. This is echoed in the available victims of crime data I sourced, which shows that child victims of siblings in relation to physical and sexual assaults in a number of small jurisdictions is a significant issue. The Kids Helpline submission also included some voices of children and young people they work with about this issue. As one young person said, "I'm 15 and live in a small country town in Australia. I've been recently abused by my older brother. He was throwing me across rooms, slamming me into walls, punching me in the face and threatening me with knives. After that, I started self-harming and I lost all my friends except my best friend. I had told my best friend and family and even the police, and nothing is still done about it. He comes up every month for about 2 weeks. That whole 2 weeks, I have to either leave the house and stay at a friend's or stay locked in my room. Another information gap concerns young people aged 15 to 17 years old and their experience with physical and sexual assault. And I think that was behind some of the questions that, I've lost a slide, so that's that. Evidence that I gathered through the roundtables and written submission indicated that an increasing number of female children aged 15 to 17 are experiencing and seeking help for violence perpetrated by their partners. However, the only data I was able to source was from New South Wales, and I was advised that the data set was not robust enough when broken down by relationship to family perpetrator and location. Nevertheless, even from this small sample, 87% of Indigenous and 84% of non-Indigenous victims of physical assault between 15 and 17 years of age reported that the perpetrator was their partner. There is a clear opportunity for improvement in both data collection and research to understand the situation for both siblings and female children aged 15 to 17 years of age. Go to the conclusion. I got there. During my examination, I met with Christy McKellar, and many of you will know Christy's story. And she shared with me her personal experience of family violence and how it impacted on her daughter. As this quote indicates, it's imperative that we recognise and understand the prevalence and impact of family and domestic violence as it uniquely affects children. To do this, we need to put children at the forefront of research and policy making on this issue. The experiences of children must be understood in their own right and not just as part of an adult situation. Children see the world differently to adults. And because of their developmental vulnerability, especially in the early years, traumatic experiences affect them in particular ways and can have long-lasting negative effect. We urgently need to generate evidence where it is missing, and we need to translate what evidence we do have into action. Historically, the needs of children have been somewhat peripheral to the public policy debate and approach to family and domestic violence, and increasingly folded into child protection responses. Our collective policy and moral objective must be to eliminate violence from the lives of children and remove it from the menu of problem solving once and for all. As I recommended in my report, we need to drive forward a national policy framework that prioritises both the prevention of family violence and responses to children impacted by it. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Gee, those statistics are just so sobering, aren't they? And again, while I'm sure there's not a person in this room who doesn't understand the impact of family and domestic violence on children, when you hear those statistics and when you think about it in terms of just the sheer numbers and the impact that it has across our society, and then the differential response again, or the impact on certain groups, I think it just is another call to action for us, I think, in terms of how we respond to this. I'll open it up for questions and then try and pull it together a little bit at the end, perhaps from a child protection point of view. Do we have any questions or comments to kick off? Microphone's running.
Hello, thanks Megan. It's Liz Orr from newly joined at ANROWS. I wondered if you had any stories to share about resilience in the discussions that you were having with children, and if you could mention any studies that are telling us about the children that are thriving despite these experiences.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think we know that there are studies that show that not all children are negatively affected. I mean, some kids are resilient. But the thing is, I don't think that we know enough about that. You know, some children are lucky enough to get therapeutic kind of intervention following exposure or being a victim of violence, but it's just the luck of the draw if you do. So most children are required to be resilient because there aren't the services out there that focus on their particular needs. And so those that are resilient get on and get through, but I don't know that we know enough in a longitudinal sense about how that really does play out throughout their lives. And you know, what we don't know is what are the factors, protective factors that and innate factors as well that actually drive resilience in kids. It was the same issue in terms of looking at self-harm and suicide as well. It's exactly the same set of issues. What makes one child more susceptible to the pressures around them and what's going on around them than others. I don't think we know enough yet. So there's another piece of research that I think somebody should be doing.
Thumbs up for that. Question down here.
Fiona Buchanan, University of South Australia. I've heard a lot recently about the intergenerational transmission of abuse, and it concerns me because, from my knowledge, there are many perpetrators who have not grown up in domestic violence, and there are certainly many children who have grown up in domestic violence who do not go on to perpetrate or endure domestic violence. I just wonder what you can say about the research in that area.
You're right, that's absolutely right. But when I do look at stats from child protection systems and juvenile justice systems in particular, you know, that the clientele is predominantly people who have experienced domestic and family violence, and quite a large proportion of them either go on to be victims or perpetrators. And so I do think there is some evidence to suggest that exposure to this is more likely than not to, you know, have that those behaviours get replicated in the next generation. So I don't think we can shy away from that. But not everybody. It's not everybody. The other pressures, of course, that are the other influences is society, and we're all here to get cultural change, and that's another reason why people go on to become perpetrators regardless of their backgrounds. But I don't know, you might have a different view to me.
Hi, it's Kelsey Hegarty. Just wanted to address Liz's question before, because Anita Morris has done a lot of a PhD on this and hasn't published yet, but she's actually talked to children as young as 8 about safety and resiliency at home for her PhD. And she found that there are factors that do help children thrive and survive, particularly if they have agency, and some of them were around naming, or if the mother named the abuse or the children did. Distance from perpetrator, which is where our family court system often orders contact, you know, which is a problem. The further distance, the more resilient, but also around other support measures. So I just say watch out for Anita's publications, because I think it's quite a unique study of about 20 families talking to the children and the mothers. So
that sounds really good. It needs to be much more work done that includes the voice of children and their experiences.
Just while you're getting the microphone to the next person there, maybe I can just from a child protection point of view, we've very recently done some really detailed analysis on the number of, on a sample, but a representative sample of the children in the care of the department in our state. And what we found, I think even though we knew it was very strong, I think it really highlighted for us again the impact of this. 91% of the children in care, of the children in care, 91% had at least one incident of family violence recorded for their parents, and 55% had 5 or more. So I think you can really see, I mean, Megan's comment about it driving child protection systems, it certainly does. But also, what I'd also say is that we are acutely aware that family domestic violence in and of itself should not be a driver for children coming into care. If our systems were able to adequately support the protective parent, the victim, with their child, and the whole system working together in an integrated way, we really do believe that there would not be children in care as a result of family and domestic violence. So I think, that's really given us really very much food for thought in terms of the way that we develop our policies, but more so the way that we the way our practice unfolds and the way that we work with other agencies to do that, because absolutely child protection is the end of the line, and what we need to do is to make sure that the system works together to really prevent that occurring.
Could I just support that? Something that did come up, and I'm sure it's been talked about in various sessions here, is that many women who experience family and domestic violence, who have children, can be loath to seek help because of fear of having their children taken away from them. So they're loath to seek help, and then the situation escalates and escalates, and then they have their children taken away from them. So for me, there's a real issue here about help seeking and the kind of response that we're able to have for women who are struggling in this situation that isn't a child protection response.
There was a question, I think, or a comment from somebody.
Liz Little from Tasmania. I'll give the name, being the ex-chair of the National Peak for Sexual Assault Services, and obviously one of the major differences between our sexual assault services in Australia and our domestic violence services is that we have long had children as our clients and actually have seen sexual abuse in families is quite critical. And I guess, Megan, firstly, I really welcome ANROWS actually putting a focus on issues around children. But I think one of the things that in this sector that we've been drawing from is the Royal Commission into institutional abuse, and many of us who are in the sector have been reflecting on the findings out of that process and what it tells us about intrafamilial abuse, including the whole culture of violence that goes on. And I guess there's many things that could come out of that, but one of the things that I would actually say is, in fact, the failure of the service systems to collaborate. The state that I come from and the services that we ran, child protection would deal with safety management by referring the children into a sexual assault service on the basis, as mandatory reporters, we would then report when they were disclosing further abuse. We knew that there was ongoing intergenerational abuse in the family, but there were a whole series of diffusing and containment processes which actually covered the risk management and the risk-averse nature of those service delivery systems rather than positive outcomes in terms of gaining safety. And I think it's a major lesson that we can learn about the way that organisations under the Royal Commission are being exposed in terms of those sorts of priorities. And I guess my challenge to ANROWS, and I think it was brought up yesterday, is how do we take this knowledge and actually move it into the sort of culture change at the organisational level, but also the practice change? When do we start seeing family violence practitioners working with child protection officers, etc., with police officers? When are we beginning to see that genuine collaboration and the pulling down of those walls and the forming of a collaborative practice framework?
Look, I'll take that as a comment. I think I can't tell you when, but I do think that's absolutely necessary, and I do think there are examples of that happening in some jurisdictions, and certainly in that national framework for protecting Australia's children, they are actually going to be piloting. I know everybody hates the word piloting, but anyway, they are going to be testing some models that do exactly that collaborate at a local level around family violence affecting children. And so that's a good thing. All power to them. And I'm sure that this is on everybody's, how can we better use the expertise that's out there in all those various systems to the benefit of the child?
Yeah, I'd probably just add to that too. I think that this is such a fantastic forum for really taking those conversations forward and to continue this momentum because, you know, so many of the presentations already have focused on the Patricia Project, for example, around, you know, collaboration across the systems, both statutory, non-statutory, the non-government sector, family court, I mean, really all of that. And I think it really is up to us in this room to be able to, you know, to really continue that push. And, you know, whatever part of the system we work on or work in, you know, that really is something that we all have to take responsibility for. But I do think, you know, I've been talking to various people during the last few days, and I think, you know, I've just never felt such a you know, a real sort of commonality around, you know, the direction that we do need to take, and that some of these fundamentals around breaking down those silos are just, you know, a critical part of that. I'm a born optimist, so, you know, I really do think that we're on a real wave of something positive. There was another comment.
Hello, Megan. It's Dr. Annabelle Taylor from the Queensland Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research. Look, I'm just raising a question that has occurred to me in listening to you, and that is around the fact that all of us are gathered here today in terms of domestic violence legislation which doesn't permit physical punishment between partners. And I wondered in regard to that about the nexus with the physical punishment of children and whether that had come up at all in the feedback and in the discussions that you've had with children across Australia.
Yeah, we do give pretty mixed messages, don't we, to the community and to kids, that it's not okay to hit a horse or, you know, hit an animal, but it is okay to hit a kid. You know, I would like us to get to a position in this country where that was not part of the toolbox of parenting, and that we parented in a much gentler, kinder, but smarter way, actually. And it did come up, of course. And you'd be surprised to know that even in some jurisdictions, corporal punishment in schools is still permitted. Well, it's not outlawed. So, not that I think it's practiced particularly, but the fact that it still exists in a couple of bits of legislation around the country, I think, is quite concerning. So, I mean, I think that whole area is a real problem in terms of what we allow parents to do to kids. And if you, my background in child protection, many of the deaths of children, assaults of children, are discipline gone wrong.
Yep, there's...
Hi, my name is Vicky Marshall from Monash University. I was just wondering what your ideas are around supporting the voice and participation of children who've experienced domestic and family violence in research and in the policy making process.
Where am I looking? Oh, okay. I just think, you know, one of the frustrations I think lots of researchers have who'd like to include and amplify the voice of children is a whole lot of practical and ethical hurdles they have to go through, ostensibly to protect children. But I don't think silencing children doesn't protect them. So for me, this is a really, really important question, and I think we ought to be doing much more research directly with children, understand their experiences. You know, we think we know what they're feeling and seeing and experiencing, but actually when you talk to them, it's a very different world that they live in. We can't speak for them. And so we really do need to ensure that their voices are front and centre. They also are very wise. Apart from wanting to fill the world with chocolate, unicorns and rainbows, which I think would be quite nice, they are very insightful about really difficult things and very willing to talk to them, talk about those things. The Royal Commission into Institutional Abuse recently did a survey about what would make children, about what would make children feel safe in various institutional settings. And the things they said were really insightful. One of the things they said was adults sometimes don't want to talk to us about safety issues. But we actually really want to talk to them because they worry that, something bad, we'll take it the wrong way or be upset with it. But what they said is the absence of those conversations makes them more afraid. And they perceive all sorts of things. They want to be involved in the conversations about safety. And they certainly want to be safe. It was that even quite old kids who have talked to me are worried about the level of aggression and violence in their worlds, whether it's close to them or far away.
Another one down the left-hand side there. Yeah. Greetings.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Manuel dos Santos from Timor-Leste. In your presentation, I can see the huge number, 14,000 of children experience violence. And I just want to ask a question, as National Children's Commissioner, do you have any experience of those victims approach directly or come directly or report directly to you for seeking assistance? Because as our experience in Timor-Leste, when the family with their children who experience violence and they approach directly the upper level, it will make influence to the perpetrator to reduce the violence to the victim. Thanks.
So I think the question was, can I do anything to support children who are affected by violence?
Yes.
Personally? Yes. No. What I can is, I don't have a role with individual children, although I do speak to them. So I can't handle individual complaints, etc. And most of that stuff goes on in the states and territories anyway. So we have a beautiful thing here called a federation, which just is a headache for all of us. And that means most of the services are delivered at the state level through organisations like many of the organisations that are here in the room, or through government agencies. So a child could approach those agencies. I don't know the extent to which children would do that, and I think that even that little stat about less than 1% of kids rang the kids' helpline about this issue is, I think, quite telling that they're not seeking help or at all. Or they're seeking it from someone else. So I think that's a really big issue, though, about how to get kids to seek help in this area, and something we should be promoting with kids. But no, a lot of kids do contact me, and I try and be as responsive as possible. But generally, I would refer them on to the relevant state or the relevant agency. Did you want to add?
Yeah, look, I think Megan probably undersells her influence. When the National Children's Commissioner talks, governments and everybody listens. So, I do think that while obviously the amount of children that Megan could have contact with directly is necessarily limited, her voice is not. So, very important role in our system. I think we've got time for one more. Oh, it says time's up. Have we got time for one more? One more and then morning tea.
Is there one more?
If there's one more. Maybe everybody wants morning tea. Okay, well, look, let's finish up. Let me wrap it up. It's been a really great pleasure for me to be able to facilitate the morning session with such a strong focus on children in their own right. Certainly Megan's work and Ray's work as well really highlights the importance of us seeing children in their own right and not just part of the adult system. And that is not to in any way diminish the important role of protective parents. But I would really like you to put your hands together and give a really good clap for both our speakers this morning. Thank you very much, and now it's morning tea.